episode of Tell Your Story. I'm Todd Nesloney, Director of Culture and Strategic Leadership for TEPSA, and each week I look to bring you different guests who have encouraged, inspired, or challenged me in one way or another, and allow them to tell parts of their story in hopes that it inspires you to get out there and be brave enough to tell some of yours. I am so stinking excited about this week's guest, and I have with me Jacie Minnick. Jacie, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are?
Hi, my name's Jacie Minnick. I am best known from being on a Netflix series called Girls Incarcerated. I was on the first season. First episode, you get to meet me a little bit, and then the second episode is sort of my big episode where I leave this maximum security prison for girls 12 to 18, and it just breaks people's hearts. So that's pretty much me. That's how most people know me.
Well, and it's so funny because my wife and I, like many, are Netflix addicts. And I had heard some about the show, but I watched it, and you're exactly right. Like your episode, I mean, all the episodes are powerful because there's humor, there's real life, but then there's so much heart in what can be viewed as despair or wrong choices, or it moves you. And your episode in particular, the moment the second one aired and you announced you were leaving, and my wife and I are sitting there in tears on the couch, I turned to her and I said, I want to have her on Tell Your Story. And she was like, how are you going to find her? And I was like, well, let's just look and see if she's on Twitter. And so I reached out and you responded, and I was like, oh my God, Liz, like she's going to be on the show. And this was like 2 months ago. So I've been looking forward to this conversation so much. So, you kind of alluded to it just then, but if nobody had ever heard of Girls Incarcerated, how would you describe the show?
So it's a show about a place called Madison Juvenile Correctional Facility in Madison, Indiana. The correctional facility is for girls 12 to 18. It's the only maximum security prison, or it was. The prison has since closed down and been moved to LaPorte Juvenile, and that's in season 2. So you can look at those changes. But basically, these are the girls that, it really off on a very long ride of decision making and hard choices and challenges that a teenager would be facing. And so when they come to us, there are very, very big walls to try to break down and break through, and a lot of growth. And I think that that's why people love the show so much, is because you really see the humanness of this place, which when you hear prison, you think of a lot of things. And this is a correctional facility, very focused on, helping these girls grow.
Well, and being an educator myself, seeing kids this age that because of their life decisions has put them in a predicament like this, I mean, for me, it was powerful. I'm always about that story of redemption. And so to get to see so many of these girls and the growth they have, I mean, that's where you get connected with them. So how did you end up working in a prison system?
Yeah, so my alma mater, Hanover College, go Panthers. We had this, maximum security prison down the road from my alma mater. And I had an amazing professor in undergrad. Her name was Dr. Stephanie Funk. She encouraged my class, my juvenile delinquency class, to go out and get involved with an at-risk youth group, and so I, being an A-type personality, was like, how at risk can I get? And when I found that there was a maximum security prison down the road, I was like, I'm going to try this out. And so there was another professor in the theater department who already sort of had his foot in the door. And I went with him and we taught theater therapy classes where the students wrote their own script and then performed it in front of the other girls. And from the first time I stepped foot into the facility, I was hooked.
Uh-huh. So I mean, you're on this. So Netflix decides to film at this prison and this maximum security, and so you've got cameras around you all the time. So what was that like with always being under the view of a camera?
Yeah, it really wasn't that strange for me, because we had a couple different documentaries come in beforehand. There were some like British documentaries, because our facility was sort of ahead of its time and it was such a unique population. And as most people will say, like those stories are just so inspiring, that I didn't even know that it was going to go on Netflix. I just thought that it was, just another documentary coming in that I probably wouldn't see. So when it comes out later, like in a couple of like months, a year, that it's on Netflix, I was like, oh, oops, I'm going to be a little bit more popular than I thought that I was.
That's so funny. So, I always tell people when they asked if I wasn't an educator, what I would do. And I always say, the first job I ever wanted was social work. I really wanted to do that, but I could never. I realized that job wasn't for me because I couldn't disconnect myself emotionally from the pain that so many of those kids are dealing with and what they're going through. I just absorbed it myself. So, knowing that you're working with these girls who come from many different backgrounds, but a lot of them very difficult background, which leads to the choices that they end up making. What did you find was the hardest part of the job for you?
Mm, I think for me, honestly, so it was less about the choices that the students made and more about the environment that a correctional facility can sometimes foster.
Mm,
When you watch the show, this is, a year after some not so ethical things had happened. When you read about juvenile delinquency and crime and corrections, or you read any sort of like scientific reports about prisons, there's a lot of things that happen. And so for me, the most challenging thing was, it wasn't challenging to be ethical, but it was challenging to see that when you're a part of a team that are supposed to be advocates for these children, there's still that stigma that, well, they made a bad choice. They're here for a reason. Therefore, they must be lying about certain things. For me, that's just a no-go.
right.
You always dig deeper. You always listen, regardless of why they're there, because that's your job. That's who you are. And so supporting them was never difficult, but watching other people not support
Right.
was very hard for me.
That makes total sense. And your episode was so incredibly moving, the one where you left, because you could tell how much you meant to those girls with the kind of heart you have, the listening ear, the understanding. What do you remember most about that goodbye? And what does it mean to you now, kind of looking on your experience there?
Yeah. Leaving was really hard. I definitely felt like I was making a difference there.
Hmm.
And one of my favorite things about the girls, working with them was watching them go home. As for most people, when they're watching this show, they feel that way. It's sort of that shows the emotional roller coaster ride that I pretty much lived every day.
Right.
And so the most memorable piece is that it takes a lot of time to break down those walls that I was talking about, but when you finally do, um, you know, y- you help them see themselves in a better light. You help them begin to trust not only you, but then give themselves a chance to trust other people for the first time in a long time. And one of the things that I think the show says without actually saying it, but I want to say it now, is that kids should not be told that they matter in a maximum security prison. Like that shouldn't be the first time that they feel
Right.
like they can make a difference in the world, or that they are uniquely wonderful and beautiful. Because hashtag kids deserve it, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, I think hearing you say that, I got emotional right there just hearing that, because these girls are teenagers, and for some of them that is the first time they've been told that they have worth. And just like you said, that shouldn't be the first time they hear that. And I believe that plays into some of the reason why they're there, is because they haven't heard that. And when you watch the show, you see these girls that portray this strength and security, and I know who I am, and then they reach a point where they can't hold that facade up anymore, and you see the doubt and the struggle and the not feeling worthy of anything. Being an adult in that space who has to constantly uplift them, obviously you're going to face your own doubts as well. How do you deal with doubt when it comes at you, when that's all day what you preach to the kids?
Right. I think for me, the biggest practice that I've picked up is just practicing gratitude. I like to keep a small book of, when it's really hard for me to smile, or when it's difficult and challenging for me to build myself back up after sort of emptying a cup all day long. When
Mhm.
it's empty and I need to refill it, I like to look through a book of like all these little things. And in Texas, we have what are called grackles. I don't know if you know what grackles are. They're like the
Uh-uh.
little black birds. They're in
Oh,
Austin.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and like one of the things I've written down before is just listening to a grackle, like walking with their little bird feet across the road. It makes like a clickety clack sound. So something as simple as that, just practicing gratitude, but also random acts of kindness. I can't tell you how many times I went through like a McDonald's line on the way home and paid for someone behind me
Oh,
just to like put something better out in the
yeah.
world because I did not feel it. It was very heavy, and
Yep.
so even though for me it was maybe a bad day, like I had the potential to maybe help somebody else have a good day. And so those are sort of my two things that I like to do.
I think that's great advice. So, a lot of people who watch or listen to this series are educators, and a lot of educators are dealing with kids that come from trauma environments and dealing with trauma. And obviously, the girls that you worked with dealt with a lot of trauma themselves. What do you see? What is a piece of advice that you would give to an educator who might be dealing with a kid that comes from trauma in their background?
Right. I would just say, like, you have to create that safe space for them. And that obviously, when you have a classroom full of kids and you barely have time to eat lunch for yourself and all the pieces that come into being an educator, those are the kids that are going to need that extra time that you
Yes.
don't have. And the thing is, like, it goes back to the statement that I made, right? That a prison shouldn't be where they told that they matter, that they have time given to them. And so putting in that extra effort. I know you're doing it with every other kid in the room, but the ones who are the most difficult are the ones who need you the most.
That's and we hear that all the time as educators, but it's so important to remember it, like truly internalize those words because they're true, and you've experienced it firsthand, like many people have who've worked with kids like that. So, I saw from your Instagram story today that you also have done some pretty cool stuff with dogs and different things like that. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So after I started volunteering at Madison Juvenile, there was a summer where I was able to be an intern at the adult facility that's across the road. And they have a program called Adopt. So it stands for A Dog on Prison Turf, which was
Oh.
started by a woman named Jessica Bradley who worked there, who was also similar to like a counselor in the adult facility. Um, but she loved animals and she saw this amazing space to take care of animals and to boost the confidence of these incarcerated adult women. And so they took dogs and cats that were quite literally on death row, days from euthanization at a pet shelter,
Mhm.
and they would bring them into the prison. They had it was like, it used to be like a staff development building that was sort of run down, so the women cleaned it up, made it pet friendly. They used all of their individual rooms. They took those and made those spaces for the animals, so they were all in
Oh.
sort of like the day room in bunk beds, because some dogs would come in with parvo or
Mhm.
some sort of like mange or something and couldn't be around the other animals. And so, yeah, they'd give up their own spaces and take care of these animals. And it was that the craziest that after a full summer of like teaching classes, which were empowerment classes for these adult women, finding out some of them were illiterate and were taking literacy classes,
Mhm.
all of these different struggles, I saw my girls that I worked with and volunteered with in these adult women. And I realized like that was where
Right.
my heart really lied, because if I could just, try to break the system, for someone, even just one person while they're a juvenile, then, before they turn 18, before they make a mistake that puts them in an adult facility, I could possibly be that change. And so I loved that program. It was an amazing summer. And my spouse and I also got our cat. Her name is Goose from that program.
Oh,
So,
that is awesome. Well, what I love about that is, and what I loved about the show too, is it's a reminder that sometimes with these incarcerated individuals, the public at large can view them as just terrible people. They need to be locked up, they need to be put away. And I think about a book that I read called All Rise for the Honorable Perry T. Cook, about a little boy who was raised in prison because his mom was incarcerated and the warden let him secretly live there. But then he goes back after being pulled out of that and goes back to interview the inmates. And the whole point of the story is that every single person there has a story. And even though they may have made bad decisions that put them in that predicament, it doesn't make them a bad person at heart. And to be able to see programs like Adopt, where you see these incarcerated women who are in those predicaments because of the choices they made, but they're not all bad people, and to be able to see them pour out their hearts and to like become these little children again who are taking care of these pets and loving on them. I think, when you're working in a prison system like that, it's good to have those reminders that look at all this heart behind that tough exterior they can sometimes so put up. And if you don't give them opportunities like that, I'm sure it just eliminates the hope for them that they can be better. And that's why I think programs like that, TV shows like Girls Incarcerated, are great reminders for the public at large that these are real people. It could be your neighbor, it could be the friend down the street, it could be somebody in your family. Just because they make a poor decision doesn't make them a bad person. Um, Having the show come out and seeing all the things that have come from it, what do you think is your biggest takeaway from being a part of that whole thing, even the prison at all?
hmm. I think I always knew deep down, everybody makes mistakes. But especially seeing how some people are held accountable for their mistakes, even, if they had some sort of, in crime and corrections, you learn about strain theory. And so if someone doesn't have the opportunity and they're put into a situation where they're constantly strained, and maybe they're trying to reach this like American dream, or they're trying to follow the rules, but they just keep not being able to make ends meet, to live, not a comfortable life, but an actual, shelter, food, water, basic need life. Then crime is a way to try to fix that and
Mhm.
try to reach those goals that are constantly being thrown at them. It seems like the only way out. And
Right.
I think that when you look back on your juvenile years, I'm not saying you, I mean, just like a general
Yeah.
you. I know for me, when I look back on my teenage years, I was a brat, and, I made bad decisions. And I think that everyone can kind of pull some stories from, their past and say, I'm really lucky that I'm not held accountable for that decision that I made with years and years to think about it.
Yeah, and there's one question that I love to end on with these episodes, and that is, when you look back at your life and the things you've been through that have made you who you are today, and you're just reflecting on all that and the girls that you worked with and everything that you've done in your careers too. If there was one thing that you wish more people knew or understood, what would your one thing be?
I think I would want them to know that this show is not just reality TV. These are real stories, and they're not singular stories. Some of the fan favorites, whose experiences your heart, they're not in who can't go home because their family can't afford to drive and get them, or they don't have
Right.
housing that allows them to go home, or they have been kicked out, and for some reason we like couldn't find housing for them even in the foster care system. And
Right.
so that's the thing, right? Is these stories are they're not made up, they're real, and they're not singular. You know, and the other thing is a lot of people feel called to help the girls on the show, but I always try to challenge folks to consider who's down the street from you,
Yeah.
who's in your community, and not just, you know, singular kids, but the families and the groups that are already doing really awesome work. How can you get involved in that?
I love that. And I think that's the perfect way to end, is that when you see things or read about things that move you, look in your community about things that may already exist or in the community next to yours and get involved. Find something that you can do to help people nearby, because everybody needs help in one way or another. Jacie, you are amazing. I love the work you do. I'm so thankful that I had this opportunity to speak with you. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on my show today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening or watching another episode of Tell Your Story. I hope Jacie's story has inspired and encouraged you the way it has me. Remember, you can check out past episodes of Tell Your Story on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, Google Play, or YouTube. They're all over the place. And join every week for a new episode. I hope today's story has inspired you to get out there and tell your story, because, like I tell you every week, every story matters.